Australia compared well in a global fee survey released today that was jointly undertaken by Isfa, the Investment and Financial Services Association of Australia, and Deloitte. We've got CEO of Isfa, John Brogden, with us today to discuss some of those findings. Thanks for joining us today, John.
Thank you for having me.
Firstly, why was this research undertaken?
Well, we wanted to make sure that Australia and Australians could easily compare what they pay in terms of fees and charges, both investment fees and management fees, for their superannuation product here in Australia against some of the larger and similar economies in the world. So we wanted an international comparison so Australians could easily compare, and that would also drive competition and hopefully force down prices.
What other markets were compared to the Australian supermarket?
We looked at the United States, the United Kingdom, Denmark, the Netherlands. So they're the markets we looked at.
There are several cases where Australia came out more expensive than the competition, and that was particularly in the industry fund sector where Australia was compared to the Netherlands and Denmark. Why would you say that was the case?
Well, the single greatest reason is scale. The scale of the Australian market, as large as we know it is still smaller and less mature than particularly the European countries. So less mature than the European countries and smaller than the US. But the other fascinating feature that we've discovered is that Australians are much more interventionist. They're much more activist investors. So if you look at, say, Europe, Netherlands, their investors are much more reserved. They don't get as involved in their investments, and as a consequence, those passive investors have lower expectations in terms of the returns. In contrast, Australians are more active investors, and active investors have greater expectations of higher returns. So they're different systems and they have different outcomes. As a consequence, the more active you are, the higher your costs are. The lower scale you are, the higher your costs are. So as Australia's industry matures and the scale gets larger, we'll see a significant reduction in costs. And the rest of it, as to investment charges, well, that is simply a reflection of an active versus a passive approach.
What would you say are the main takeouts of the fee survey for Australian super funds?
Well, the main thing is that Australians are activists, and if you are an activist investor, that costs more. But in most cases, certainly not in the current market, but say for 10 of the last 12 years, we've seen activist investors getting much higher returns than passive European investors who get very passive returns. So I think the most significant outcome is Australians are more active in their investment, and in most cases they get better returns than more passive investors.
The US came out cheaper than the Australian super funds in almost all categories. Why would you say this was the case?
There's no doubt the most significant thing with the US is, despite not having a compulsory superannuation system like Australia, it is just such a larger market. So that is the first thing. And also the US is very big in corporate funds. And what we find with corporate funds that are shrinking and disappearing in Australia, in contrast, the corporate funds in the US can in many cases absorb more costs. So the company will absorb some of the costs of the administration, thus reducing the charge.
Do you expect to be undertaking this research again next year?
We'd like to do it. It's not a cheap piece of research, but I think it's quite instructive. It also has lots of holes. I mean, there are very few other countries that report as much data as we do in such a granular manner. So despite those, we would look to do it again to provide a good trend in terms of the comparisons internationally.
What changes would you have expected to have taken place in the next 12 months if you do the survey again?
In 12 months' time, I'd expect to find a few changes. The first one is there'll probably be fewer funds. We'll see more mergers, and that's across the superannuation sector. The second thing is I think we'll see much more competition and therefore lower fees for investment fees and advice fees. And also I think we'll begin to see a reduction, I hope, in administration costs. I don't think we'll see it as much as we'd like. We've got a long way to go in terms of reducing administration costs in Australia, but we're now putting it very clearly on the table, so it's on the agenda. We need a combination of funds reducing their costs and at the same time government doing a bit of mandating so that they force costs to be dropped.
So would you say that the news on fees has been good for Australian investors?
Well, it's good news. I think there are two very important points. Number one is that we do compare favourably. Australia's superannuation costs, both in terms of investment fees and administration fees, compare very favourably internationally. And number two, as favourable as those costs are, we still have some distance to go. So if you take a summary that says we are very comparative in terms of what we cost, but we can improve our costs. I think you could see Australia actually leading the world in terms of the investment costs and the administration costs of superannuation.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.